The sterile hum of machinery filled the air in Syra Holt's lab, the soft pulse of technology grounding her in the present as her hands flew over the worn surface of her workbench. Her workspace was a chaotic mosaic of wires, old data pads, and tools, a testament to a woman obsessed with her craft. She hadn't seen daylight in hours, not since she'd found herself back here again, at the edge of discovery, on the cusp of unraveling a riddle that had eluded her for years. The flickering glow of her monitor cast harsh shadows across the room, highlighting the intense focus in her eyes. Syra's fingers paused as her gaze shifted to the temporal device in front of her, a relic from a time long past, one she was trying desperately to fix. It had been a breakthrough back then, a machine meant to stabilize time's fractures, a technology too powerful for anyone to truly understand. The singularity, the event that had shattered time itself, had left behind countless remnants of broken, unstable moments. Fragments, echoes of the past and future, clashed together in a fractured dance that threatened to swallow reality. Syra had been trying for years to understand it all. But this was different. She pressed a final command on the terminal, and as if in response, a soft ripple pulsed across the device. The screen shifted, its static clearing just enough for Syra to make out a peculiar distortion, a fleeting image of a cityscape. But not the modern, gleaming towers of Echelon that she knew so well. No, this was something older, something worn and lost to time. The buildings crumbled beneath the weight of age, their once sturdy foundations long since eroded. And the sky, its gray clouds twisted, swirling in a way that made Syra's stomach turn. It was as if time itself were breaking apart. Her pulse quickened as the image flickered again, now flashing across the screen in rapid succession. Echelon skyline appeared, but the view was fragmented, warped. She blinked, pressing her hand to her forehead in disbelief. That wasn't possible. Not unless. Impossible, she muttered to herself. I must have made a mistake. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could correct the anomaly, a soft ping echoed from the corner of the room. A new notification had arrived. Her brow furrowed. Only one person would be sending her a message at this hour, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Syra hesitated, her hand hovering over the screen for a beat too long before she tapped the notification open. It was a brief message, no greeting, no pleasantries, just cold, hard facts. A report from the Temporal Data Institute. _subject. Irregularity detected. Immediate investigation required. _. The timestamp was a few hours old. The message noted a time rift of unknown origin had been detected near the outskirts of Echelon. Syra's stomach dropped. She had heard rumors of these anomalies, the jagged tears in the fabric of reality that no one had been able to explain. The singularity had left its mark on the world, and the consequences were still being felt in the form of these strange distortions. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The irregularity was just another piece in the puzzle she'd been chasing for years. But this was different. Something deep in her gut told her that this anomaly had something to do with the fragment she'd just witnessed on her screen. That image of a broken, crumbling cityscape was no coincidence. She could feel it in her bones. That city, it wasn't just an echo. It was a warning. Syra stood up from her desk, grabbing a worn leather jacket from the back of her chair and pulling it tightly around her. The lab was cold, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the growing unease that had settled deep inside her chest. Her fingers brushed the surface of the temporal device, and for a brief moment, she thought she felt a pulse, a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She shook it off. She had to get to the anomaly. Now, the streets of Echelon were eerily quiet as Syra walked through the labyrinth of alleyways that led to the outer edges of the city. The neon lights of the corporate districts flickered above her, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement below. The air was thick with the scent of machinery, oil, and rust, smells that seemed out of place for a city that prided itself on innovation. But here, on the fringes, the progress of the future had yet to touch the grime and decay that festered in the forgotten corners of society. Syra's boots clacked against the concrete, her heart racing as she drew closer to the source of the anomaly. The sounds of the city seemed to fade into a haunting silence, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. Her mind kept returning to the strange, fractured image she'd seen earlier. Was it a glitch? A malfunction? Or something much, much worse? The air grew thicker as she approached the site, a forgotten industrial district that had long since been abandoned. As she rounded a corner, she felt it, an unnatural chill that settled in her bones, a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just the cold. There was something wrong here, something unnatural. And then it happened. The ground beneath her feet trembled, faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. She staggered slightly, instinctively reaching out to steady herself against the nearest wall. A pulse of energy shot through the air, humming like the vibration of a tuning fork. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tremor stopped. Syra froze. Before her, in the distance, the rift had appeared. It was nothing like she had ever seen before. The sky above twisted in on itself, a kaleidoscope of colors that bled together in impossible patterns. The very air seemed to shimmer, distorting as though reality itself were peeling apart at the seams. Time, her time, was being unraveled, and in the center of it all, a jagged line stretched across the sky, the source of the distortion. A crack in the fabric of existence itself. Syra took a step forward, her breath shallow as she stared at the rift. There was no telling what could happen if she approached too closely, but she felt a magnetic pull toward it, a feeling she couldn't explain. The temptation to know, to understand, to solve the mystery that had haunted her for so long, was overwhelming. She hesitated, but only for a moment. With every ounce of willpower, Syra Holt moved toward the rift, ready to confront whatever lay beyond it. And as her fingers grazed the edge of reality itself, the world around her flickered one last time. Syra's boots echoed on the cracked pavement, the sound hollow against the backdrop of the disintegrating skyline of Echelon's outer districts. The heart of the city, the gleaming towers, the corporate havens, and the tech sanctuaries, felt miles away, even though it was just a few layers of urban sprawl in between. She had always been drawn to the edges, to the places where civilization frayed at the seams, where the decay of the old world met the futuristic ambitions of the new. But tonight, the city felt different, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The frayed streets twisted and turned, marked by forgotten buildings, their rusted shells standing like ancient monuments to a lost age. Neon lights sputtered, casting a sickly glow over the damaged infrastructure, bathing the scene in an eerie pallor. Overhead, holographic advertisements flickered, promoting the latest in cybernetic enhancements or time manipulation devices, things that promised the future, yet felt entirely out of place in a world so desperately clinging to the past. Syra's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by the rift she had seen, by the anomaly that had appeared out of nowhere. She couldn't shake the image of the ruined cityscape, the jagged skyline, and the way time itself seemed to distort within the fractured view. Was it a future yet to come? Or had she glimpsed the past, a memory of the world before the singularity? Was it possible that the rift itself was a bridge, a doorway to a time before everything went wrong? Her comm link buzzed in her ear, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an encrypted message, one that didn't come from her usual sources. Helios Voss. She paused, her fingers instinctively hovering over the communicator as the name flashed on the screen. A shiver ran down her spine. She knew the name, of course. Everyone did. Voss was a ghost in the system, a name whispered in dark corners of Echelon. A rogue leader who controlled a faction of time manipulators, a group that believed humanity could rewrite its fate by seizing control of time itself. It was his kind of obsession that had caused the fractures in the first place. The message was brief, cryptic, and laced with a chilling tone. You've seen it, haven't you? The rift. The doorway to what we can change. Meet me at Sector 7. We need to talk. Syra's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse quickened. Helios was closer than she thought. She had heard rumors about Voss's group, whispers of dangerous experiments and terrifying ambitions. They wanted to manipulate the very fabric of time, to bend it to their will, to rewrite history itself. Syra had always believed that tampering with time, even with the best of intentions, was an invitation for disaster. But now, with the rift appearing, her carefully held beliefs were beginning to crack. The city seemed to close in on her as she moved, the sound of her footsteps becoming louder, more oppressive. She passed through an alleyway lined with darkened storefronts, shops once teeming with the latest tech and artificial intelligence gadgets, now left abandoned in a hushed, mournful state. The remnants of a world that had been, slowly decaying into obscurity. In the shadows, the people of the fringe districts huddled in their meager shelters, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, the weight of their struggle pressing down on them. Syra's thoughts swirled with uncertainty as she approached Sector 7, the meeting place Voss had specified. There was a heaviness in the air here, a weight that made every breath feel like it could be the last. She reached the location, a dilapidated building on the outskirts, its walls scarred by time and neglect. The door was ajar, an invitation to step into the unknown. Inside, the faint glow of flickering screens illuminated the room in eerie flashes. The smell of burnt circuitry and ozone lingered, mixing with the dank scent of mildew. In the center of the room stood Helios Voss. He was tall, his figure imposing even in the dim light. His face was sharp, carved with angles that spoke of both intellect and ruthlessness. His eyes, however, were what unsettled Syra the most, cold, calculating, and devoid of empathy. "You came," he said, his voice smooth, almost welcoming. "I knew you would." Syra took a cautious step forward, her body tense, every sense heightened. She didn't trust him, she couldn't. But the urgency of the anomaly was too great to ignore. She needed answers. She needed to understand. "I don't have time for games, Voss," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "What is this rift? What does it mean?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It means everything, Syra. The world is broken, fractured beyond repair. But we can fix it. We can rewrite it. The rift is a doorway to a new future, one where we control time, where we can change the mistakes of the past, and create a new world from the ashes." Syra's stomach twisted at his words. She had heard it all before, the promises of control, of power over time. But she wasn't so easily swayed. "You're talking about playing God. You can't control time, Voss. You don't know the consequences." Helios stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm doing. And so do you. You've seen the fractures, Syra. You felt the pull of the past, the way time doesn't align. It's only a matter of time before everything unravels completely." Syra's mind raced. She had never thought Voss would be the answer, but now, in the face of the rift's destruction, his words seemed more dangerous than ever. Was he right? Could they fix the world, or were they merely sealing their doom with every manipulation of time? As Syra stood before him, a decision loomed, one that would shape the future of humanity itself. Would she stand by and watch as Helios played with the very fabric of existence? Or would she fight to preserve what little remained of the world? The air around her seemed to hum with tension, the fractured world waiting for her choice. The cold wind howled through the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse, a haunting cry that echoed off the rusted metal beams. Syra stood at the threshold, her breath shallow as she stared into the dim, musty interior. The flickering lights overhead cast erratic shadows on the walls, which seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The place was a relic, forgotten by time, untouched by the progress the city so desperately clung to. Yet, here she was, caught between past and future, standing at the center of something that threatened to undo everything she thought she knew. Helios Voss hadn't been lying. The rift was real, and the consequences of its existence were already beginning to ripple outward. It was an echo, a fracture in the fabric of time that stretched further than she could see. She could feel it now, in the air around her, a tangible tension, an unspoken weight that pressed against her chest. The world was beginning to shift, and she was caught in its wake. "You're not leaving yet, are you?" Helios's voice broke through the oppressive silence, his words low and almost coaxing. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she faced him. The tall figure of Voss was a silhouette against the flickering lights, his face hard and unreadable. He had been eerily calm, even as the world around them seemed to collapse inward. There was a purpose behind his actions, a single-minded obsession that Syra couldn't ignore. But something about his presence felt off, like he was already steps ahead, already mapping the road to destruction with an ease that made her stomach churn. "I didn't come here to play your games," she said, her voice steady despite the unease settling deep in her bones. "I came for answers. You know more about the rift than you're letting on. I need to understand what it really is." Helios chuckled softly, his dark eyes gleaming with a knowing intensity. "And you will. But first, you need to see what's coming." He stepped forward, motioning for her to follow him. "There's a place, a point of convergence. The rift isn't just a tear in time. It's a beacon, calling out to something, someone." Syra hesitated. Something in his words stirred a deep unease. "What do you mean, someone?" Helios' smile was almost predatory as he gestured for her to follow him deeper into the shadows of the warehouse. "Time itself has a consciousness, Syra. It watches, it waits, and it reacts. And those who think they can manipulate it, well, they become prey." The words hung heavy in the air as he led her to a series of old, weathered screens embedded into the far wall. The screens flickered, casting a sickly green light across the room, their static screeching with the sound of digital interference. Syra's eyes darted to the screens, watching as images flashed across them, scenes of chaos, of worlds colliding and spinning out of control. She saw glimpses of the ruined cityscape from the rift, now warped and distorted, as if it were slipping between timelines. There were flashes of figures, shadowy, indistinct, darting across the frames, like phantoms caught in the shifting spaces between moments. "You're chasing shadows," Syra whispered under her breath. "What am I looking at?" Helios didn't answer at first, his gaze locked on the screens. He seemed to lose himself in the images, watching with an unsettling calm as they flickered through different times and places. "These are the echoes," he said finally, his voice distant. "Flickers of what could be, what might have been, or what is yet to come. Each one is a ripple, a shift, a shadow of something, someone who's been lost in the fractures." Syra's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. The rift wasn't just distorting time, it was pulling people, real, living people, into its chaos. The figures on the screens were no longer just shadowy blurs. She could see the outlines of faces, vague but human, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in fear. They were trapped. The worst part? She recognized them. Her own face appeared on one of the screens, distorted, caught in the shifting tides of time. She gasped, her chest tightening as the image flickered and vanished, replaced by another, a woman, young and with dark hair, looking back at her with an expression of terror. Syra didn't know her, but the sense of dread was immediate. "What is this?" Syra shouted, stepping back, her pulse racing. "Who are these people?" Helios turned toward her slowly, his eyes piercing through the dim light. "They are echoes of the past and future, Syra. They are the ones who've crossed into the rift and never made it back. Each one of them left a mark, a trace, an imprint, on the fabric of time. And now, they're being pulled back in. You want answers? Look at them. Look at yourself. They are a warning." Her mind spun. This was more than just an experiment gone wrong. It was a danger that reached beyond the rift itself. Whoever or whatever was causing these distortions wasn't just tampering with time. They were using it as a weapon, and she was caught in its path. "We need to stop this," Syra said, her voice tight, her fists clenched. "Before it's too late." Helios looked at her, his lips curling into a cold smile. "It's already too late, Syra. We're already chasing shadows." The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. There was no escaping it. No matter how far they ran, the rift was closing in on them. And if they didn't act fast, the shadows would consume them all. Syra took one last look at the screens, her mind racing with the weight of what she'd just seen. Then, without another word, she turned and fled into the darkened corridors of the warehouse, the chill of the unknown pressing down on her every step. She wasn't running from the shadows. She was chasing them. The streets of Echelon felt suffocating now. The buzz of the neon lights, once a familiar hum, now seemed to throb with a deeper, more ominous undertone. Syra's footsteps echoed in the empty alley as she tried to shake the image of the rift from her mind. The screens had shown too much, too many faces, too many fractured timelines. She could still see the twisted, unfamiliar face from the screen, a woman whose eyes haunted her thoughts. Someone was out there, caught between moments, slipping through the cracks of time. But who? She wiped her face, pushing the questions back, refusing to let them swallow her whole. There was no time to dwell on uncertainty. The rift wasn't waiting. It was growing, pulling them all deeper into its grip. Syra ducked into a quiet building, its glass windows smeared with grime. The low hum of old technology buzzed in the background, casting a dim light over the row of data terminals lining the walls. This was a forgotten hub, an old archive space, hidden away from the prying eyes of the corporate overlords who controlled Echelon's heart. It had been her safe haven once, a place where her curiosity could roam freely without being confined by rules or surveillance. But now, it was a prison of memories, a place where the past clung to her like a shadow. At the back of the room, an ancient terminal flickered to life as she approached. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tapped in the security codes. The screen crackled for a moment, then settled into a glowing blue interface. She entered a series of commands, bypassing the old encryption with the precision only someone familiar with the systems could manage. This place was supposed to hold answers. It always had, before the city had fractured, before the future had become a blur of possibilities and fear. The screen blinked, bringing up an archive file. Her mother's name appeared in the header. Syra's breath caught in her throat. Lana Solis, the woman who had disappeared. Her mother had been a scientist, a theorist in temporal mechanics, obsessed with the very thing Syra had witnessed in the rift, the manipulation of time. Syra had been just a child when her mother had vanished, taken by the same obsession that had consumed the world. No one had ever found out what happened to her. Some believed she had died in a lab accident. Others whispered that she had simply vanished into the cracks of time, lost forever. But Syra knew better. Her mother's work had been too important, too dangerous. A series of encrypted logs appeared on the screen, dated back to a year before her mother's disappearance. Syra's fingers hovered over the keys. She hadn't expected to find anything this soon. Lana had been careful, hiding her experiments from those who would exploit them. But there was something else, something different. The files seemed to tremble under her gaze, almost as though they knew she was coming for them. Her pulse quickened. She accessed the first file, _ the Temporal Rift Project, Phase 1 _. The document was incomplete, disjointed, as if part of it had been torn away. But there were glimpses, fragments, that began to piece together something Syra had never fully understood. Her mother had been working on something monumental, something that had caught the attention of Echelon's highest authorities. But there was more. The rift, as Syra now knew it, wasn't just an accident. It was a result of human intervention. It was a test gone wrong, but not in the way Syra had assumed. Her fingers gripped the terminal tightly as her mind began to race. Her mother hadn't just studied time. She had tried to manipulate it, to control it, to understand the fractures and the possibilities that lay beyond the linear flow of reality. And then, as Syra scrolled deeper, a final note appeared, its words stark and chilling. The rift is not merely a crack. It is a conduit, a link between the past, present, and future. If we open it fully, it will tear the fabric of everything we know. But if we close it, the damage may be irreversible. A cold sweat began to form on Syra's forehead. This wasn't just about her mother. It was about the fate of the world. The rift wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice, a dangerous experiment that had gone far beyond anyone's control. Her heart raced. She had thought she was chasing shadows before, but now she realized the truth. This wasn't just some rogue scientist playing with time. Her mother had understood the risks. She had known what would happen, what could happen. And now, Syra was left to pick up the pieces. But with the rift growing stronger by the day, and the echoes of the past closing in on her, Syra realized something far more chilling. The past wasn't done with her yet. A figure had appeared on the screen in the final moments. Her mother's face, twisted and broken by time itself. Syra's breath caught as the figure seemed to reach out to her, as if pleading for help. But what could Syra do? The rift was a wound, an open gash in the timeline, and it was pulling them all toward the edge. The past wasn't just fractured, it was alive, and it was waiting for her. The rift was closing in on her, and Syra could feel it now, in the marrow of her bones. It wasn't just the distortion in the air, the strange hum that filled her ears every time she got too close. It was something far more insidious, something subtle that gnawed at her from the inside. Time itself was becoming unraveled, a never-ending loop that twisted tighter with each passing moment, dragging her along in its wake. She sat in her apartment, the soft glow of the terminal screen casting long shadows on the walls. The city outside was alive with the pulse of neon lights, but inside, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that spoke of impending doom, where every tick of the clock felt like a heartbeat slipping away from her grasp. Cyrus scrolled through the files again, her eyes flicking over the encrypted notes her mother had left behind. They had become a map, a breadcrumb trail through the labyrinth of time that her mother had tried to navigate, and now, it was Cyrus' burden to follow. The rift wasn't just a tear in the fabric of reality. It was an active force, alive, aware, and ever hungry. She'd seen the figures on the screens in the warehouse, the fleeting faces trapped between moments. Those echoes weren't just the result of the rift. They were a manifestation of its power, its ability to consume time itself. Her fingers hovered over the next file. Underscore the temporal convergence theory, underscore another piece of the puzzle. Another terrifying truth. The theory proposed that time wasn't linear. It wasn't a steady flow from past to present to future. Instead, it was a vast ocean, with moments colliding and converging in unpredictable patterns. Every decision, every action created ripples, small disturbances in the fabric of reality that spread outward, touching every point in time. But when too many ripples collided, they created a wave, and that wave could overwhelm everything in its path. Syra's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the theory. The rift wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of countless collisions. Her mother's work had brought those collisions into focus, experimenting with the very fabric of time itself. And now the rift had become the eye of the storm, its gravity pulling in everything within its reach. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as her mind spun with the implications. If the rift was the result of so many colliding moments, then what would happen if it collapsed? What would happen if the force of so many fractured timelines merged into one? She had to stop it. She had to find a way to close the rift before it consumed them all. Her eyes darted to the door, and for the briefest of moments, she saw something flicker in the corner of her vision. An afterimage, a shadow of someone that wasn't there. A face. Her mother's face. Syra froze, her pulse racing. The shadow dissolved before she could fully comprehend it, but it was enough. The same face she had seen on the screen, twisted in time, had just appeared in front of her. It wasn't possible, but the rift didn't care about the possible. It cared about the inevitable. The hum in the air grew louder, and the walls around her seemed to ripple, distorting like a mirage. Time was fracturing around her. The past, the present, and the future, everything was bleeding together. Suddenly, the door to her apartment burst open, and Helios Voss stepped inside, his eyes sharp, his face grim. "It's happening," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "The convergence is nearly complete." Syra's heart skipped a beat. She turned to him, her mind still reeling from the vision. The echo of her mother's face still burned into her thoughts. "What do you mean? How do you know?" Helios's gaze was distant, almost pained. "I've been tracking the fluctuations. The rift is reaching its tipping point. If we don't act now, it will tear apart everything we know. And worse, it will pull everything into its center. It's not just a matter of time anymore, Syra. The rift is becoming something else. Something alive." Syra stepped closer, her breath shallow, trying to steady herself. "What do you want me to do?" "There's a place," Helios said, his voice dropping lower, almost as if he feared speaking the words aloud. "A convergence point where all the ripples, every fracture, will merge. It's the only place where we can stop it, but we have to get there before the rift fully opens. If it does, it will be too late." Syra nodded, her thoughts a whirlwind as the weight of his words settled over her. The rift wasn't just a wound. It was a living thing, a force that would continue to grow until it consumed everything in its path. And now, She had a chance to stop it. But she knew this wasn't going to be easy. Time was no longer a fixed thing. It was fluid, shifting, and nothing in the world could be trusted to stay the same. She turned toward the door, the hum of the rift still echoing in her mind. The countdown had begun. Every moment that passed brought them closer to the edge. Every step, a plunge deeper into the tides of time. The city of Echelon was a monument to the future, a gleaming skyline of chrome and glass. But as Cyrus stood at the edge of the observation deck, overlooking the sprawling metropolis, she realized that everything was a facade. The lights below blinked like stars in a sky that no longer existed. The rift had already altered the course of history, and Echelon was merely a shadow of what it once was. Helios stood beside her, his sharp features bathed in the dim glow of the horizon. The weight of his words from earlier still hung in the air, thick with dread. The convergence point was approaching, a place where time itself would fracture completely, unleashing the chaos of 1,000 realities. Their mission was clear. They had to reach the heart of the rift, or everything would be consumed. But as Syra looked out at the city, she knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be just a race against time. It would be a war with time itself. The paradox war, Helios murmured, as if reading her mind. It's not just the rift we need to fight. It's the collapse of everything. We're facing a war where past, present, and future collide. Choices made in one moment ripple through the others. Nothing is what it seems anymore. Syra's gaze hardened. So we're not just stopping a rift. We're fighting against the very fabric of existence itself. Helios nodded. Exactly. The rift doesn't just pull us through time. It creates paradoxes, realities that overlap and tear at the seams. We could be fighting against versions of ourselves, versions of the past, versions of people we know, and we won't even recognize them. They might be us, or they might be enemies from timelines that were never meant to exist. Syra clenched her fists, her mind spinning with the implications. The past she had known, the future she had hoped for, all of it could change in an instant. What if the version of her mother that had vanished into the rift was still out there, but twisted by the paradox? What if she had become an adversary, one who didn't remember the daughter who was trying to save her? The rift is a battlefield now, Helios continued, his voice low, tense. And the enemy is time itself. The paradoxes will keep multiplying, pulling us into alternate versions of reality. We'll be forced to fight battles on fronts we can't even see yet. Cyrus shivered at the thought, her mind already racing through scenarios, possibilities, traps. But there was no time to waste on doubts. The mission was clear. The paradoxes were not just a threat. They were the war. A sudden tremor rattled the floor beneath them, a low rumble that sent ripples through the ground. The rift's pull was growing stronger, tugging at the very structure of reality. Cyrus' heart skipped a beat. Prepare yourself, Helios said quietly, his eyes steely and resolute. The first paradox is coming. We won't have much time once we enter the zone. Before she could respond, the world around her seemed to distort, the air shimmering like heat on a summer day. The skyline wavered, flickering between moments, between realities. One moment, the streets of Echelon were quiet and orderly. The next, they were aflame, a war zone where shadowy figures clashed in violent fury. Syra felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw them. The soldiers, the survivors, all battling in a reality that shouldn't have existed. The past and future were bleeding together. It was a war that had no boundaries. Stay focused, Helios warned, grabbing her arm as the landscape continued to flicker. We move fast, or we'll be caught in the middle of it. The paradoxes won't wait. They dashed toward the exit, the ground shaking beneath them as the rift's pulse grew louder, the sound of its pull becoming deafening. The buildings around them began to collapse in slow motion, bricks crumbling and rising again, caught in an endless loop. Time was no longer a linear concept. It was a battlefield, and Syra could feel herself being drawn into it. As they ran through the streets, a figure appeared ahead of them. A woman, draped in shadows, her face distorted like a mask made from fragments of memories. Syra froze. The woman's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw recognition. But the recognition was fleeting, slipping away like a dream fading at dawn. No, Syra whispered, her throat dry. It can't be her. Helios stopped beside her, his gaze narrowed. That's a paradox. A version of your mother, or someone pretending to be her. The woman smiled, but it wasn't her mother's smile. It was twisted, cruel, as if she reveled in the chaos. You should have stayed out of this, Syra, she said, her voice laced with an unfamiliar coldness. The rift is beyond saving. You're fighting a losing battle. Syra's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't the woman she remembered. This was something else. The ground beneath them shifted again, and in an instant, the world collapsed into darkness, the rift's pull growing stronger. They had to keep moving, or the paradoxes would swallow them whole. The fight wasn't just about time. It was about identity, about the very essence of who they were, and who they would become. The paradox war had begun, and there was no turning back. The final rift loomed before them, its edges glowing with a terrifying, unearthly light. Syra's pulse quickened as the tension in the air grew palpable. They had made it. Through countless paradoxes, twisted realities, and endless confrontations. But this moment felt different. The rift was no longer just a tear in time. It had become a force of nature, wild and unpredictable, something that could devour entire timelines in an instant. Helios stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the anomaly before them. The convergence point was within their grasp, but it wasn't just a place. It was the very nexus of time itself, the point where all the realities, all the choices, and all the moments would come together in a catastrophic crescendo. Now or never, Helios said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. This is where we stop it. Syra nodded, her eyes narrowing. She had come this far, through moments of doubt and uncertainty, but now there was clarity. The paradoxes they had encountered, the versions of herself and others that had stood in their way, had only served to reveal the truth. Time wasn't just a line, a series of moments stretching from past to future. It was a web, an intricate tapestry of interconnected threads, all pulling at one another. The rift was not just something that had to be closed. It had to be rewoven. We can't just close it, Syra said, her voice low but resolute. We need to heal it. If we don't, it'll tear through everything we've fought to save. Helios met her gaze, his expression a mixture of understanding and determination. You're right, but we're not doing this alone. With a final glance at each other, they stepped forward, the air thickening with every step. The rift pulsed, sending ripples through the space around them, distorting the world into strange, surreal shapes. For a brief moment, Syra thought she saw her mother again, her face distorted but somehow familiar, reaching out through the cracks in time. But Syra didn't falter. She couldn't afford to. They reached the heart of the rift, and the world around them seemed to collapse. The air crackled with energy as a storm of fractured timelines spun in every direction, tearing apart the reality they knew. Syra closed her eyes and stretched out her hand. The threads of time swirled around her like a vortex, chaotic and violent. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She understood now that she wasn't here to fight time. She was here to restore it. She focused on the memories, the moments, the choices that had led her here. Each one was a thread, a fragile, delicate strand that needed to be mended, not erased. With every ounce of willpower, she began to pull the threads together. Slowly, at first, but then with more confidence, the rift began to close, the chaotic storm of paradoxes dissipating, one by one. The fracture in time started to heal, its edges knitting together like a wound mending. Syra, Helios said, his voice tinged with awe. It's working. The rift's violent pulse slowed, then stopped altogether. Silence enveloped them, a strange, peaceful stillness that felt foreign yet comforting. The fractured timelines were no longer crashing against one another. The world, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was whole. Syra opened her eyes, taking in the calm before them. The sky above had shifted, no longer darkened by the twisted shadows of collapsing time. The city of Echelon stretched out before them, unchanged but more vibrant, as if the very air itself had been renewed. Helios stepped closer, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. You did it. Syra's heart swelled, with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She had never imagined that such a moment could exist, one where time itself was at peace, where the rift had been sealed, and the world had been given another chance. The battle had been fought, the paradoxes had been overcome, and the rift had been healed. But in that quiet moment, Syra realized something more. The world they had saved wasn't perfect. It was still fragile, still uncertain. But now, it was theirs to shape, theirs to protect. A new dawn was breaking on the horizon, and for the first time, Syra felt the weight of the future not as a burden, but as a possibility. They had restored the balance, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Time, with all its complexities and challenges, was no longer an enemy. It was a gift, and as the sun began to rise, casting its first light on the city, Syra took a deep breath, knowing that the true journey had just begun.